Thank you for joining me. When your world is falling apart, tonight's lesson. This is for the 15th, I believe it is, or the 16th. Yeah, the 16th of January, because I'm always 1 week ahead because I have viewers who are from other time zones, and if I wait till a little bit later, it's already passed for them. So that's why I'm doing this now. All right, when your world is falling apart. Fascinating study. Let's begin, as we always do, with a word of prayer. Loving Father, we thank you for this opportunity we have to be together, to study together, to learn together. We're so thankful that in your word you have given us information about things like this when our world is falling apart, because we all experience this from time to time. Right now it seems very pertinent to us. But your people have often been in these situations, and you have great guidance and counsel for us. And this situation in which we find ourselves is no exception. Our world seems to be falling apart. Lord, help us understand how to get through this as your children. We ask that in Jesus' name. Wow. Certainly hard to believe that the events could be much more dramatic than they have been in the last week in the United States. Unprecedented, literally unprecedented things have been happening. But so far, despite some of the alarmist calls, the system seems to be holding itself. It's holding itself together. All right, definitely. All right. Yes, an interesting comment. Technology works until it's time to use it. That is often my experience as well. All right. Our memory text for this week is from Isaiah 7:9. And this is the prophet Isaiah who is telling Ahaz, the king of Israel, the king of Judah, actually, king of Israel is someone else, as we'll find out. But he's telling the king of Judah that he has to have faith. If you will not believe, surely you shall not be established. That's just the way that works. If you will not believe, you will not be established. And that's where we find ourselves in this study. And that is the problem we have, I think, all times in our life. The lessons are titled as follows: Danger from the North, Attempted Interception, Another Chance, Sign of a Son, and God is with us. And we'll look at those and see how they fit into a compact lesson, which they do actually quite well. Ahaz is focusing. He's the king of Judah, and he is focusing on his political situation, his military situation, and the problem he has is very simple. Assyria, you see it there at the top, almost the top of the map, the red circle around it. Assyria is the great bully. It is the empire. If you had asked people living at the time of Ahaz, they would have said that Assyria was the greatest nation and that it was the greatest threat. They could not have imagined. They did not imagine, as we shall see. Certainly Ahaz didn't imagine that within a very short time, even in human terms, within about a century and a half, Assyria would cease to exist. Now, my generation understands this fairly well because we went through this with the end of the Soviet Union, which for our generation, we were born I was born in 1950. The Cold War began in 1945, right after the World War II ended. And it existed from 1945 to 1989. For 44 years, it looked as though, and the Soviet Union had been there since 1917, it looked as though that was going to be forever. We just took it for granted. That was going to go on and on and on. But it didn't. And when the end came, it came rapidly. We have taken for granted Dave Barry in his book, Dave Barry Turns 50, written about 20 years ago. He said that when there was nothing left in the Middle East but microorganisms, thousands of years in the future, those microorganisms would be fighting one another. I wonder if he's surprised to find out that there have been a series of peace agreements between Arabs and Israelis in the Middle East. And that list seems at least possible and likely to grow. So what looks like it's permanent from a human point of view, often we find out from God's point of view is not permanent at all. And that's the problem, is we only see what's around us now, and oftentimes we focus on the wrong things. And in fact, at this time, Ahaz, although he would say that Assyria is the great bully boy in the neighborhood, he is concerned about two nearer nations. You'll see Jerusalem is down. There's a little square, a little rectangular box down there, near the Dead Sea, and he's concerned about Aram. The king of Aram is up there, and he's concerned about Aram, who is allying himself with, or at least the possibility of the two of them allying with Israel, the kingdom to the north. Israel was the larger kingdom. It was 10 tribes instead of 2. It was larger territorially than Judah was. So Judah is this tiny little thing. And we showed this a week or two ago, that this is the land bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe. If you want to take an army over land, you have to go through this area, through Jerusalem, through Israel and Judah. You just have to. And so that he's concerned about that. Aram and Israel are hoping to leverage this and get some power out of it. And they are probably going to, at least it seems very likely, they're going to attack Judah. And in fact, that happens. 2 Kings 15:37. In those days the Lord began to send Rezin the king of Aram and Pekah the son of Remaliah against Judah. Now, it's important to understand that 2 Kings, the chroniclers who wrote 2 Kings, they're saying that the Lord began to send Rezin king of Aram and Pekah the son of Remaliah against Judah. He is sending them because, as we shall see, the Judah, which was the supposedly the faithful remnant, the line of David runs through Judah, and we hope that the line of Judah will bring the Messiah. At least they do at that time. They believe that it will, but they hope that it will. And so that's important. But Judah has become very apostate. Judah is ignoring what God wants them to do. In fact, it's worse than that, as we shall see, as the lesson reveals to us. Then Rezin king of Aram and Pekah son of Remaliah, king of Israel, marched up to fight against Jerusalem and besieged Ahaz. Now again, we mentioned this, that Jerusalem sits on top of a ridge, on top of a hill. And so when it says that they marched up, they had to literally march up. But they could not overpower him. Now, you might think one would get a message out of this. The first thing is, they came. God is trying to send Judah a message. The problem is Judah's not listening. These two kings came and they besieged him, but they could not overpower him. Now, one of the reasons that it was so difficult to besiege Jerusalem, in fact, Jerusalem was never conquered externally. Every time that it was conquered, it was because of internal problems, either internal traitors or just internal weakness. And one of the reasons for this is that, unlike most ancient cities, by far and wide the most ancient cities, the great cities, Babylon, Alexandria, Thebes, Damascus, the great ancient cities were on rivers. You needed a source of water. You had to have a source of water to live. But unlike all of those, and even those who were on the sea, unlike any of those, Jerusalem is perched on a mountaintop or fairly high ridge, and it is fed by springs. And that is important because not only was it fed by springs, but over the years, they dug tunnels. And those tunnels would carry the water so that the people could receive the water even during siege, and they did not have to expose themselves to danger. That's a big deal. And we shall see that's going to play into some fairly important things here as well. Now, the house of David was told, Aram has allied itself with Ephraim. So the hearts of Ahaz and his people were shaken as the trees of the forest are shaken by the wind. These are not, the picture is not of rational beings reacting to a situation, but rather of plants that have no rationality, who are just simply being affected by the elements around them. And that's what's happening here. Ahaz and his household, the household of David, are terrified. And they're doing everything they can. Now, this happens all the time. It happens to us, too. Sometimes we find ourselves in desperate straits, and we keep searching for whatever works. I was told this a number of years ago when I had spoken to the young adult leaders in a certain conference, and they began to implement some of my suggestions, and then they tried several other things. And I asked the youth leader, I said, what's going on here? And he said, well, our conference president is just trying to get anything he can. He's grabbing at everything. We see this. And unfortunately, it was ineffective because everything isn't something. Here they are. They're terrified. Ahaz sent messengers to say to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, I'm your servant and vassal. Now, this was not something. Remember that when Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land, God told them not to make alliances with any of the people of the land without asking him first. And the Gibeonites came and duped them into thinking they'd come a long distance and caused them no end of trouble over the years. And here he's not supposed to do this, but he's lost track of his destiny. That's what we talked about, a crisis of identity, which leads to a crisis of leadership. And by the way, this is true in denominations. This is true in nations. This is true in all sorts of settings. When an organization, when a group, when a body does not have a clear sense, when a person does not have a clear sense of identity, it's difficult to have a clear sense of purpose. What are you there for? How do you do? And you will have a crisis of leadership. And that's what happens here. And so he says, I'm your servant and your vassal. He's not supposed to be their servant and vassal. He's supposed to be God's servant. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and the king of Israel, who were attacking me. Now, they had attacked him, but they had not prevailed. He's afraid they'll do it again, and this time it won't work. And for that reason, he enlists the help of Assyria. Well, this is very much like what Winston Churchill said about appeasement. Appeasement is feeding everyone else to the crocodile in hopes that he'll eat you last. And that's kind of what's happening here, because Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace and sent it as a gift to the king of Assyria. This is a clear indication of total desperation. He's emptying the temple of God, temple of the Lord, and the treasures in the royal treasury. He's sending everything and saying, we can't eat silver and gold, basically. We can't drink it. If you'll save us, at least we'll have life. That's his belief. That's his approach. Unfortunately, it always, appeasement is kind of like responding to blackmail, extortion. And that is, you give them something in the hopes that that'll be enough. But of course, once the extorter realizes that with a certain threat they can get more out of you, they keep squeezing. And that's what's going to happen to Judah. Not only in the reign of Ahaz, but in the reign of his son, Hezekiah. But we'll get there slowly. The king of Assyria complied. Now, he did what he was asked. Hey, he wanted to go there anyway. He wanted to take out Aram and Israel because they were in his way. Unfortunately, Judah doesn't exactly understand that they're in his way too. But the king of Assyria complied. He gets paid, so he didn't even have to pay for the expedition. The king of Assyria complied by attacking Damascus and capturing it. He deported its inhabitants to Kir and put Rezin to death, the king of Israel. He put him to death. I'm sorry, the king of Damascus. And he deported its inhabitants. This is what the Assyrians did. This is what they did. They took a nation, they took the people away from their land, from their gods, and they dispersed them. And over time, they disappeared. This happened to Aram, and it's going to happen to Israel. We know this from history. The 10 northern tribes are conquered, they're carried into captivity, and they are dispersed. And they never are heard from again. The 10 lost tribes of Israel, they're lost because of many factors, but one of them is that it was Assyria who conquered them. Now, when it comes to Ahaz, this is the problem. Ahaz followed the ways of the kings of Israel and also made idols for worshiping Baals. Now, we have this very uncomfortable thing. We don't like to talk about this. In the Old Testament, God says, especially at this point in Israel and Judah's history, is that they went whoring after other gods. This is, very, very, at least, at the very least, a coarse description, right? It's something you don't really want to say in polite company. Coarse description. Well, but in fact, what we will see is that's exactly the kind of behavior that's taking place here with Ahaz. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom, that's below Jerusalem. And he sacrificed his children in the fire. This is Moloch or Chemosh, the gods of the Moabites or the other Canaanites around them. This is a vicious practice. Engaging in the detestable practices of whom the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. These nations had practiced these things, and God says he was driving them out because of these practices. And now, in his desperation, Ahaz is doing exactly the same thing. Well, one might take a warning from that. If he drove out the other nations, maybe he would drive out Judah as well. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops, and under every spreading tree. This is a guy, if you want to talk about whoring after other gods, he does it everywhere with everyone. That's what's happening here. He's totally promiscuous when it comes to worshiping other gods. His behavior, and God, no wonder God says what he does about them. And this is Ahaz, king of Judah. He's doing all of these things, whatever God he can find. He is trying, again, he's reaching for everything he can find. He's doing everything in every way possible, so far as he's concerned, that has a chance of getting someone's aid, whether it's Assyria's aid or whether it's Chemosh or Molech or the Baals or whoever, whatever gods, whatever forces he can call upon, he wants to call upon them, except for one. Except for one. And that's the problem. And here's we had this. He's told that Aram and Ephraim have allied themselves. Now he doesn't have to worry about two powers to the north. It's two powers that are unified in wanting to destroy him. It's not surprising he is frightened by this. We all get frightened by things at times to time because we're focusing on what we can do and on what other human beings can do instead of on what God can do. I have the same problem. So I'm going to give the lesson some structure here. Danger from the north. And what you see is that Ahaz's behavior is driven by fear. He's afraid of everything. He's asking for help from anything except, again, the Lord of Judah, Yahweh, Jehovah. He's not asking for help from the one who created everything, from the one who drove out the other nations before the Israelites so that there could be a Judah and an Israel. And he's duplicating their behavior in such a way that it seems likely he's going to suffer the same fate, or his nation will. And he's doing all these detestable things. And I'm describing as promiscuous, detestable. You look at it, it's really disgusting. I don't even want to go into the details of child sacrifice. It's disgusting. It's horrific. So how does God respond? God responds by trying to save him. It is always amazing how humble God is. God has no pride. Not only how humble he is, but how far he is willing to go to save his people. And so he attempts to intercept. And what he does is he tells Isaiah to take his son, Isaiah's son, and to meet Ahaz, who's out. He is inspecting one of the conduits. We talked about this. You see, he's continually in concern over being besieged and overtaken by other forces. And so he's going to inspect and make sure that the conduits that bring fresh water inside the city are secure and that they're working properly, so that when the time comes, they will have the water they must have, so that they will be able to survive. And so Isaiah goes and takes his son there. This is an act of faith, his taking his son. This is could be a dangerous place. And Isaiah says this remarkable thing to Ahaz. He said, ask the Lord for a sign, be it as high as heaven or as deep as hell. In other words, as far as the human imagination can reach, that is how far God is willing to go. Anything you want. Now, we're told, and Ahaz is going to use this, they were told in Leviticus not to put God to the test, which is the word that is often translated temptation in both the Old and New Testaments, the Greek and the Hebrew words. To the test is what temptation is. It's putting you to the test. When Jesus replies to Satan in the wilderness, he said, you shall not tempt the Lord your God, in King James. Modern translations will say, you shall not put your God to the test. In other words, this whole thing, well, if God is God, he should do so-and-so. God says, I'm not a performing seal. I don't do just whatever you want me to. You can't summon me that way. So you don't put God to the test in that way. He's not going to perform tricks for us to demonstrate that he exists. For one thing, it obviates the need for faith. There are a lot of other bad things about it. But here, because he sees, and Jesus says in the New Testament, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, it is a tiny seed. If your faith is the size of a mustard seed, that's enough. And here Ahaz, it was demonstrated by his desperate actions and his worshiping other gods and his sending envoys to other kings and sending out money from the treasury and from the temple, and money and treasures. He's demonstrated that he has almost no faith at all, but God is appealing to that tiny bit of faith that he may have within him. That mustard seed of faith, he's appealing to that. And he said, it's ordinarily, I wouldn't allow you to do this. But I want you to be saved. I want to deliver you. And on this occasion, you can ask for a sign of any kind from me, as high as the heavens, as deep as hell. Any sign you can think of, ask me for a sign, and I'll take care of it. It's an amazing thing. But Ahaz, who's already basically committed himself, actually committed himself to Assyria by sending them all these treasures. He's done all of these things. He's committed. And he gives a very pious sounding answer. But Ahaz said, I will not ask. I will not put the Lord to the test. This is pious posturing on his part. It's pathetic. It's terrible. But we all do it. When we are caught by God, when we do something we shouldn't do, we try to justify it. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in meetings where people, board meetings, church board meetings, school board meetings, where people are justifying despicable behavior, despicable actions. And they'll say, well, he had his reasons, or she had her reasons. Well, of course she did. Of course he did. Everyone has reasons. That doesn't mean they're valid. Don't tell me their reasons. Tell me what those reasons are. And here, Ahaz is pretending to have a pious reason for not doing what the prophet has explicitly said God wants him to do. And this pious reason is, he says, I will not put him to the test. I'm better than that. I am, I'm pious. I'm devoted. I'm very careful about these things. Truth is, he's done. And so Isaiah says, well, I'll give you, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. He'll give you a sign whether you ask for one or none. He'll give you a sign. And this sign comes in Isaiah 7, verse 14. And it gives birth to one of the, no pun intended, it gives birth to one of the most controversial texts in the Old and the New Testament, because this verse is quoted in Matthew. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Why is this controversial? Well, the problem is, and by the way, the opportunity is for salvation. He's offering to save Ahaz, if Ahaz will just demonstrate a little faith. He's offering to save him politically, save him physically, and of course, eventually salvation spiritually as well. But this word has given us a headache. The Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and he will call him Emmanuel. Now, it isn't really clear who he is. The Lord himself, will he call him Emmanuel? But anyway, here we have it, this text. Did the prophet write more than he knew? A lot of people say, well, he really was predicting the birth of Jesus. And it appears that Matthew is saying that, although those who have heard me talk about Matthew, and based on Hans Lorendell's wonderful work on this, it's quite clear that that's not what Jesus was what Matthew was doing. He was doing something very wonderful and very beautiful, but he understood what was going on here. However, and so the default answer to this question, did the prophet write more than he knew? I'm going to say this way. The default answer to this question, wherever it occurs in Scripture, is no. Now, by that I don't mean that John the Revelator or Daniel in Daniel 11 and 12 knew the identity of the nation or the individual that he was prophesying about far in the future. That's not the point at all. What I mean is, did he write something about in a spiritual sense? In this sense, when he's talking about that there will be a child who will be conceived, and that child will, before that child is of a certain age, which is just old enough to tell right and wrong, is all he says, before a child is that age, then he says, Israel and Aram, are going to be no problem to you. In fact, Assyria is going to be. I didn't say that in so many words, but that's what he's saying. Before he's right and wrong, your doubts, your concerns are going to disappear. That's his sign. There will be a child born within 9 months, obviously, of this. And within that 9 months, with that child, by the time the child is 4, 5, 6, I don't know, but just a few years, these terrible, these powers that you fear so much are going to disappear. They're not going to be any problem to you. Lord will deliver you. That is the message that's being given to Isaiah, or through Isaiah to Ahaz. The question then becomes, is he also predicting the birth of Jesus? And as I say, because it's clear that he's talking to Ahaz about that situation right there at that time. That's very clear. And ordinarily we would say that did he also predict this other thing? Was he also aware of that? Other than that, we would ordinarily say no. The default is no. Because the prophet wrote better than he knew, that means that we are the ones that it was written to, and that we know more than the prophet did. And there's a problem with that whole notion, because it ends up meaning that we can basically turn prophecy and prophetic interpretation into almost anything we want. And people do it all the time. But here's a difficult case. It's not difficult because it's quoted in Matthew, as I say, Hans Lorendell's work, and I've used it a lot because it's so beautiful, takes care of that problem. But there is the problem. All right. The problem, I'm going to keep going. I have no way of, I know I have nothing to do other than keep going here. It says here there's a problem, but I can't do anything about that. The problem is this: the word virgin, that's translated virgin in King James and in some of the other translations, in Isaiah 7, that word is a problem. And it may indicate that that Isaiah had an inkling about something that we didn't give him credit for. And the problem is really quite straightforward. The virgin will conceive. The Hebrew word that Isaiah uses is Alma. And the problem with that is that Alma is ambiguous. It generally means a young woman of marriageable age. And in that time, that would automatically include the fact that she was a virgin, because that's how you got married. John Oswalt says that probably the best word in English is maiden, because maiden implies virginity, but doesn't say that, at least in our context, directly, although it's what it meant in olden times. But the problem is it's an ambiguous term. It isn't clear whether it just means a woman, a young woman, or whether it means a virgin. It's not that clear. Now you say, well, okay, but he's talking, the general rules of interpretation say he's talking to, God meets people where they are. He's talking to Ahaz in the 8th century BC. And so he would be telling Ahaz that this was a young woman that would conceive. It doesn't have to be a virgin. There's not a virgin birth. Surely, in the Old Testament, that would be a remarkable thing, wouldn't it? I'm not aware of anyone who thinks that is true. So what do we do with this? Well, that's the Hebrew word. The problem is that he could have used, Isaiah could have used Isa, or one of its variants, Itza, which simply means woman. A woman will conceive. The woman will conceive. Now, ordinarily, again, we'd say, because in chapter 8, the child is born. The child, and by the time that child reaches the point where he knows right from wrong, the other powers that Ahaz is so frightened of don't exist anymore. They're gone. And so that's the fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah 7. Ordinarily, we just say, well, that has to be what it really meant. It was just an odd choice of words. Here's the problem. He could have also used virgin, the Betula, which is, I'm not very good with Hebrew pronunciation, so don't hold me to that. But there's a word that means virgin explicitly. It's not, there's no ambiguity. But Alma includes both of these meanings. It could mean both or either, both and. It just isn't that clear. It's ambiguous by its nature. Another word for a young girl is na'ara. And this is used very often in betrothal narratives. We have na'ara. So we have these 4 terms, 3 of which are pretty clear. One of them was absolutely explicit. but he uses a fourth word. And it's not common. So why in this passage does he use this word? Well, again, to project that he has some inkling that there's going to be a virgin birth of a Messiah in the future is putting a lot on it. And we would end it there and say, well, it's just unlikely. There wasn't a virgin birth here in Isaiah, so he probably just meant young woman. I've said that myself until I got into this study and found out that it was more complicated than I anticipated. Because when the Jews themselves translated the Old Testament Hebrew into Greek, something called the Septuagint, you've probably seen it if you've done much Bible study, the LXX, it's called the 70. The Septuagint, and this was done, we don't know exactly when, but somewhere between 250 and 100 BC. In other words, well before the birth of Christ, the Septuagint was already finished. It had already been, the Hebrew Old Testament had already been translated into Greek. And so these 70 elders that met and were the committee that translated the Septuagint, what word did they use? Because they did it in the Greek, and we have a better, and here's the problem. They used the word Parthenos. And Parthenos is explicit. There's no doubt about what Parthenos means. In fact, there's another word, parthenogenesis, which means virgin birth. And Parthenos is virgin. There's no question about it. There's no ambiguity. It's straightforward. And so the Hebrew translators of the Old Testament, when they translated it into Greek, they had all 4 of these words in the Hebrew. They knew about this thing. And they had multiple choices in the Greek, and they chose Parthenos. So that makes it a little more difficult. If they had chosen one of the other words in Greek that was not explicit, be easy. We just say, well, no. But they chose Parthenos. And this is, again, before the birth of Christ, and this is the Jews themselves who choose this. Apparently, they saw something in the text that indicated this might be the case. So, did the prophet write more than he knew? Well, the answer probably is no. But it may well be that he knew that something bigger was implied in the prophecy he was giving to Ahaz. How do I say that? Remember, Isaiah is a literary masterpiece. Isaiah has a broad scope and a broad view and a deep understanding of God's plan of salvation. That's why it is quoted in the New Testament more than any other book in the Old Testament. In fact, more than all the other books in the Old Testament combined. Isaiah gets it. And again, we want to review the fact that Jacques Ducan of the seminary tells us that when the Jews talk about understanding the Old Testament, they say first read the Pentateuch, books of Moses, and then read Isaiah. For them, for the Jews, Orthodox Jews, Isaiah is central to the understanding of Judaism, of the Old Testament. And so because of this strange implication that he uses this unusual term which is ambiguous, it appears to me that it's possible. No more. Not making any kind of absolute prediction. But it appears to me that it's at least possible that Isaiah, again with his enormous scope and understanding of God's plan of salvation, and the fact that it's a literary masterpiece, the words are not randomly chosen. They're very carefully applied. Isaiah may have had an inkling that what was happening there and then in Judah had implications larger than for Judah there and then, but for the entire plan of God's salvation for his people. Can't prove it. Not making an absolute statement. I am saying he didn't write better than he knew. He may have had this inkling, and that's maybe why he chose this word. Is it certain? Of course not. Doesn't come that easy. The important things never come that easy. But there it is. This text is crucial, clearly, to understanding what's going on in 8th century or late 8th, early 7th century Judah. But it's also he may have understood that it had tremendous significance for the future, for our day, for the days that would come when God would, in fact, bring a Messiah that was greater than the merely human members of the house of David. So that's I just find that all amazing. That's what's here. Is there more than he knew? I don't know. But Parthenos is no question. It's a virgin. And the Jewish elders who translated it saw it that way. So there's something in the text, something in the whole conception here, no pun intended, something in the understanding of this passage, both for Isaiah and for the elders who translated it into Greek, that something more was happening here. It appears to be. I can't say certainly, but it certainly appears to be the case. And finally, it says, he shall call his name Emmanuel. God with us. God is with us. And there's something transcendent about this, because this is not Isaiah saying to Ahaz that when you see this child that is born of this Alma, this young woman who may be a virgin, this ambiguous term, when you see this child, when they're old enough to tell right from wrong, he says you will be delivered. But he doesn't say then you will know that God is with you. The name of the child is God is with us. That's what he shall call him. Now, the child was actually named Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz, which is the longest name in the Bible, and not one that has caught on in the recent years. And you often wonder what he would be called for short. But anyway, but that still is in the text. He shall call him Emmanuel, God with us. And God is with us is a present tense. It is not a future tense. It is not God will be with us. It is not past tense. God was with us. It is the present tense. God is with us. And it's amazing because this is in some ways an echo of the name that God declares for himself, Yahweh, which is I am that I am. I am who I will be. There's a lot of ways of going about that. The whole point is it's present tense. God is present in a particularly intense fashion. And that's what the promise is here. Not God will be with us, but God is with us. Isaiah is trying to say to Ahaz, God is with you. Reach out. Test him. He's asking you to test him. Reach out. Ask him in faith. Reach out. God is with us. What's going on around you may be terrible. What's going on around you may be frightening. It may be chaotic. It may be unprecedented. It may be something which fills the future with uncertainty, but God is with us. that isn't going to change. It hasn't changed since the creation, and it will not change ever. We may not be with God, but God is with us. All we have to do, He's always there. And as I realize this, as I'm studying this, and as I'm sharing this, I have to tell you, and I hope it brings to you the same thing it brings to me, which is it brings to me a good deal of peace. Yeah, the world is falling apart. It appears to be unprecedented, frightening, portentous events seem to be, we never know what's big and what's not. They seem to be taking place all around us. It looks as though we are going into a future filled with danger. But God is with us. And I will say this, we talk a lot about the time of trouble, about the last things, about the end times. That's the only thing we need to know to go through the times of greatest temptation, the times of Jacob's trouble, as it's described in the Bible. All we need to know is to hang on to the fact that God is with us. It's not a matter of our performance, of our faith being so strong, of our having confessed every sin. We don't even know half of the sins we've committed. How are we going to remember them and confess them? We don't even know what they are. It takes more than that. It's not a matter of our works or our performance in any sense of the word. It's a matter of trusting God and recognizing He is with us. And we have to recognize that. My wife tells me she was terrified when I went in for cataract surgery. I was a little afraid myself. But I realized that God was with me. And I have a friend who's just gone through surgery, and I'm very concerned and praying for her. But I recognize that she's in God's care. God is with her. If you have friends who are suffering, and many are, from COVID and other things right now, from loneliness, God is with them. This consciousness, this awareness, this continual knowledge of the presence of God in our lives, it's hard to hang on to. At least it is for me. But this is where salvation lies. And it was the same for Ahaz. That's the great thing about the stories of the Bible. The Bible is narrative. I've talked about that many times. It is stories. And it is, yes, there are prophecies, and yes, there's poetry and a lot of other things. But the main point about the Bible is that it is stories of how God was with us. How God was with us. Theologians say that what the Bible is about is salvation history, the saving acts of God for His people. Clearly that's true, but it's easy to lose sight of the fact that it is present tense. It is not that God was with the children of Israel when they faced the Red Sea, or that they were being pursued by the greatest army in the world, the Egyptian army. It is not that Ahaz was being besieged by Israel and Aram. It was not that Ahaz was afraid of Assyria. It was not any of these things. God always is with us in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. And that is what these stories are about, that God was with them. He is with them. They didn't realize it in the present tense sometimes. Neither do we. But that is the ultimate message of this passage, this mini story within the larger narrative of Isaiah. Goes through the reign of 4 kings, of whom Ahaz is only the third. And it's a crisis. And these crises will continue. But Isaiah's understanding of this, and we mentioned this when I talk about, is there possibility that he foresaw, had an inkling, a hint of the virgin birth of Christ? And the answer, I think, has to be yes, because the vision we know, as I mentioned before and learned from John Oswald, Isaiah is the only prophetic book. In fact, it's the only book in the Bible that speaks to generations yet unborn. Now, again, I have to make this clear every time I say it because it sounds crazy in some ways. But when Daniel wrote about the future, he was writing to his audience in his day, telling them what was going to happen way out there. When John the Revelator was on Patmos and he was writing about the future, he was writing to the 7 churches. He says so. He's writing to them, his audience on that day, which is one of the reasons we can interpret Revelation. He was writing to his audience on that day about events which would take place in the future. But Isaiah, in the last few chapters of his book, addresses the people of the future. That's an amazing thing. Someone with that kind of vision, that kind of insight may well have had an inkling that the birth of this child, whom God calls God with us, in the late 8th century BC, is actually a foretaste, a foreshadowing of another child who will be born of a virgin, who is God with us and always has been. Well, I hope you're finding Isaiah to be a treasure chest. I am every week amazed, and I'm grateful to God because, like you, I live in this world and I see things which can be overwhelming as long as I focus on them. But when I can, and I do, I mean, I can tell you, I get discouraged. I'm frustrated. I have my own sometimes loss of sleep recently because I'm focusing on the wrong things. And I need to come back again and again and again. God is with us. That is the truth, the reality which matters more than any other. As Paul tells us, if God is for us, if God is with us, who can be against us? And what does it mean for them to be against us? Who cares? I mean, we'd rather it didn't happen, obviously, but if God is with us, we have no concerns because God will prevail. And so we can take each of these experiences, as trying as they are, and they are certainly trials, and use them to build our faith. This is not, for most of us, the dark night of the soul. As my friend has discovered, we most of us go through the dark night of the soul at least twice in our Christian experience if we keep moving forward. I've been through the dark night at least once, and I may have gone through it twice, but I don't know. But what's happening now, as frightening as it might be and as unsettling as it might be, this is, at least not for me, the dark night of the soul. And maybe that's how it works. I don't know. I just know that we have to go through that. And every time we can build our faith, every dark experience, whether it's the dark night of the soul or a mini trial, and oftentimes the tiny trials, it's the paper cuts that hurt the worst. Every time we can reject anger and doubt and distrust and choose instead trusting God and recognizing that God is with us. Every time we do that, we strengthen our faith and we experience more fully kingdom life in this broken world. Well, I'm going to have to quit for now. We've reached longer than most of you are going to spend on this lesson anyway. I thank you for joining me, and I hope that it has solidified your grounds for belief and has made you feel stronger than ever and more trusting of God than ever. For that is the ultimate preparation for heaven. Well, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, and of these various other catastrophes which appear to be taking place around us, if they don't intervene, then I plan to be here next Thursday night live. And I hope that you will join me as we go through these Bible journeys together and as we experience more of God's grace. Anyone wants to see more of my material, you can find it on patreon.com. You see it at the bottom of the screen there. And you can reach me with any kind of concern or question at BibleJourneys@yahoo.com. That's one of my email accounts. So don't hesitate if you have a question. I love to share with people who want to learn more. And oftentimes they stimulate me to learn more. So until next week, may the Lord bless you and keep you in the palm of his hand.